I'm Leslie Dowker, 32, and I'm a Marine Corps First Sergeant who's spent 2 decades proving myself in places most people will never see. For years, I sent money home, flew back for every family emergency, and made every effort to be there for birthdays, weddings, and hospital visits, all while serving my country overseas. But when my father stood up at my sister's wedding reception and called me the family failure in front of 200 guests, I decided it was time he met the daughter he'd never bothered to really know. Have you ever been dismissed by the very people you've sacrificed everything for? If so, drop your story in the comments. You're definitely not alone. Before we dive in, let me know where you're watching from. And if you've ever had to show someone exactly who you are after they've written you off, smash that like button and subscribe for more stories about standing your ground and demanding the respect you've earned. What happened when the Marine Honor Guard walked through those ballroom doors? Let's just say my father's perspective changed real fast. I was always the middle child who learned early that being quiet meant being overlooked. In a family where personality was currency, I was perpetually broke. My older brother had Dad's charm and easy laugh. My younger sister had his dramatic flair and commanding presence. I had his stubborn streak, but none of the qualities that made people lean in when he spoke. Dad was magnetic in the way some people are born to be. At barbecues, he'd hold court by the grill, spinning stories that grew more elaborate with each telling. Neighbors would gather around him like moths to flame, hanging on every word about his college football days or his early years selling insurance door to door. He had this way of making ordinary moments sound epic, turning a flat tire into an adventure worthy of Hemingway. I admired that about him, even as I recognized I'd never possess it. While my siblings basked in his reflected glory, I found myself watching from the kitchen doorway, learning his rhythms and cadences, but never quite brave enough to step into the light myself. He'd ruffle my hair sometimes and call me his little thinker, but his eyes would already be scanning the room for someone more interesting to talk to. When my brother graduated high school, Dad threw a party that lasted until sunrise. When my sister got her first job, he took her out for a steak dinner and told everyone at the restaurant she was going to run the company someday. When I graduated valedictorian, he said, "That's nice, honey," and asked if I'd help him move the lawnmower to the garage. The pattern was established early and held firm through my teenage years. I learned not to expect much fanfare for my achievements. Good grades were assumed, not celebrated. When I made varsity soccer, Dad missed the games because of work. When I got into 3 different colleges, he asked which one was cheapest. I wasn't bitter exactly, but I was clear-eyed about my place in the family hierarchy. At 17, I started researching military academies. At 18, I walked into a Marine Corps recruiting office and signed papers that would take me 3,000 miles away from home. Dad's reaction was predictable. Well, that's one way to see the world. My mother cried. My siblings were already planning their own escapes to state schools within driving distance. Boot camp at Paris Island broke me down and rebuilt me into something harder, more focused. I discovered I was good at the military in ways that surprised everyone, including myself. The structure appealed to me. The clear expectations. The way merit mattered more than personality. I excelled in training, graduated near the top of my class, and felt something I'd never experienced in civilian life: pride in belonging somewhere that valued what I could do. Over the years, I sent money home when Dad's business hit rough patches. I flew back for emergencies, weddings, graduations, and hospital visits. I made every effort to be present for the moments that mattered to my family, even when it meant burning leave days or changing deployment schedules. I wanted them to know I cared, even from a distance. But my gestures were rarely acknowledged in ways that felt proportional to the sacrifice they required. When I sent $500 to help with my sister's wedding, Dad mentioned it once in passing. When I flew home from Okinawa for my grandfather's funeral, arriving 12 hours before the service, Dad's only comment was that I looked tired. When I got promoted to sergeant, he said, "That's great," and immediately changed the subject to my brother's new apartment. I began to understand that military service, in my father's worldview, was something that happened to other people's children. It was abstract, distant, vaguely noble, but not particularly relevant to real life. He'd tell people his daughter was in the military the same way he might mention she was in accounting, a job, nothing more. By 30, I was the odd one out in a new way. My siblings had settled into traditional lives with spouses, mortgages, and children. They lived within 50 miles of our childhood home and gathered every Sunday for dinner. I was the one who called from different time zones, the one whose life was measured in deployments rather than anniversaries. Dad's comments about me began to carry an edge I hadn't noticed before. Always off somewhere, he'd say when I missed family gatherings. Never in one place long enough to put down roots. There was disappointment in his voice, as if my career was a phase I was taking too long to outgrow. At family dinners, when I was home, he'd introduce me to friends as my daughter, the one who travels for work. He'd mention my siblings' promotions, their children's achievements, their home improvements. My military service became a footnote, something mildly interesting but ultimately irrelevant to the conversations that mattered. I started to realize that somewhere along the way, my father had decided I was the family disappointment. Not because I'd failed at anything, but because I'd succeeded at things he didn't understand or value. My accomplishments were too foreign, too far removed from his experience to register as real achievements. The realization didn't devastate me the way it might have when I was younger. I'd found validation elsewhere, in the respect of my fellow Marines and the satisfaction of work that demanded everything I had to give. But it stung nonetheless. This gradual understanding that the man whose approval I'd once craved had written me off as the one who never settled down, never figured out what really mattered. I kept coming home anyway, kept trying to bridge a gap that seemed to widen with each visit. Because he was still my father, and some part of me still hoped that someday he'd look at me the way he looked at my siblings, with pride instead of puzzlement, with understanding instead of mild disappointment. The shift from teasing to cutting happened so gradually I almost didn't notice it at first. Dad had always been sharp with his humor, quick to find the weakness in any situation and exploit it for a laugh. As kids, we'd learned to give as good as we got, trading insults around the dinner table like a verbal boxing match. But somewhere in my late 20s, his comments about me stopped feeling playful and started feeling personal. Always off somewhere became his standard response when I couldn't make it home for holidays or family events. The words themselves were innocent enough, but the tone carried something new, a resentment that felt disproportionate to the offense. When I missed my cousin's graduation because I was deployed in Afghanistan, Dad mentioned it to relatives for months afterward. She's always off somewhere when we need her. The irony wasn't lost on me. I was off somewhere serving my country, but in Dad's narrative, I was just being selfish. At my nephew's birthday party, I showed up in uniform because I was flying out that evening and didn't have time to change. Dad looked me up and down and announced to the room, "There she is, playing dress up again." The other adults laughed because they assumed I was in on the joke. I smiled along because correcting him would have made the moment awkward for everyone else. But later, in the kitchen, I heard him telling my uncle about how I never grew out of wanting attention. The comment hit wrong because it was so far from the truth. I'd spent most of my life trying not to draw attention to myself. The uniform wasn't costume. It was my profession, my identity, the thing I'd worked hardest to earn the right to wear. Family dinners became exercises in careful navigation. Dad would ask about my siblings' jobs with genuine interest, wanting to know about their projects, their colleagues, their office politics. When he asked about my work, it was with the polite disinterest you'd show a stranger. Still enjoying the military, he'd ask, the same way you might ask someone if they were still enjoying their hobby. When I tried to share details about my responsibilities or deployments, his eyes would glaze over. If I mentioned the places I'd been or the training I'd completed, he'd nod absently and change the subject to my brother's latest promotion or my sister's new house. My accomplishments were too foreign to register as real achievements in his world. The comments escalated as my sister's wedding approached. Dad had been planning the event for months, treating it like his personal showcase. He'd booked the best venue in town, hired the most expensive caterer, and invited everyone he'd ever met. This was going to be his moment to demonstrate what the family was capable of when we put our minds to it. 2 weeks before the wedding, I was home on leave, helping with last-minute preparations. Dad was in his element, coordinating vendors and double-checking details with military precision. I suggested a few logistical improvements based on my experience managing large-scale operations, but he waved me off. "I think I can handle a wedding," he said. "This isn't a war zone." The dismissal stung more than it should have. I'd spent years learning how to organize complex operations under pressure, but my expertise didn't count in civilian contexts. In Dad's mind, military experience was somehow less applicable to real-world problems than his experience selling insurance. 3 days before the wedding, we were discussing seating arrangements when he looked at me thoughtfully. "You're not planning to wear your uniform to the ceremony, are you?" I hadn't been planning to, but something in his tone made me defensive. "Why?" "It's your sister's day. Don't make a big scene." The implication was clear. My uniform was a distraction, a way of drawing attention away from where it belonged. Never mind that I'd worn civilian clothes to every family event for the past 5 years. Never mind that I'd never tried to make any event about me. In Dad's mind, my military service was inherently attention-seeking, a cry for recognition that threatened to upstage his carefully orchestrated celebration. I assured him I'd wear a dress, but the conversation stayed with me. Here was my father, the man who'd taught me the importance of service and sacrifice, treating my career like an embarrassing phase I should have outgrown by now. Here was the man who'd raised me to be independent and strong, disappointed that I'd become exactly what he'd taught me to be. The day before the wedding, he was giving me final instructions about my role as maid of honor. "Just remember," he said, adjusting his tie in the hallway mirror, "tomorrow's about celebrating what really matters. Family, commitment, building something that lasts." He paused, meeting my eyes in the reflection. "Not everyone figures that out, but your sister did." The message was unmistakable. My sister had figured out what mattered: marriage, stability, conventional success. I was still wandering around in uniform, playing at being important while missing the point of adult life entirely. I nodded and smiled, because arguing would have accomplished nothing. But something hardened in my chest, a resolve I hadn't felt since my first days at Paris Island. I'd spent years trying to earn his respect on his terms. I downplayed my achievements, minimized my service, and pretended my career was just a job like any other. Tomorrow, at my sister's wedding, I'd let him see exactly who his middle daughter had become. Not because I wanted to steal attention from my sister, but because I was tired of pretending my life's work was something to be ashamed of. The reception was everything Dad had envisioned: elegant, expensive, and perfectly orchestrated. The ballroom gleamed with crystal chandeliers and white roses, 200 guests dressed in their finest clothes, champagne flowing like water. Dad moved through the crowd like a conductor leading his symphony, greeting guests, directing staff, and basking in the compliments about what a beautiful event he'd organized. I sat at the head table in a navy blue dress, playing my role as maid of honor with military precision. I'd given my speech earlier, keeping it short and sweet, focused entirely on my sister and her happiness. I danced with the groomsmen, posed for photos, and made pleasant conversation with relatives I saw once a year. Everything was going according to script. Dad looked magnificent in his tuxedo, silver-haired and distinguished, every inch the proud father. He'd been working the room all evening, telling anyone who'd listen about his daughter's perfect wedding, the vendors he'd selected, the details he'd personally overseen. This was his moment, and he was savoring every second. When dinner ended and the toasts began, Dad took the microphone with the confidence of a man who'd never met an audience he couldn't charm. He started with the usual platitudes about love and marriage, working the crowd with practiced ease. People laughed at his jokes, nodded at his wisdom, and raised their glasses when he told them to. He was in complete control of the room. Then his eyes found me at the head table, and something shifted in his expression. A slight smile played at the corners of his mouth, the look he got when he was about to deliver a particularly sharp punchline. "I want to take a moment to talk about family," he said, his voice carrying clearly through the sound system. "My wife and I have been blessed with 3 wonderful children, each one unique in their own way." He talked about my brother first, the successful businessman with a beautiful wife and 2 kids. The crowd murmured approvingly as he described my brother's latest promotion, his new house, his son's little league team. Then he turned to my sister, the bride, talking about her career, her kindness, her obvious happiness with her new husband. The room was warm and receptive, exactly the audience Dad thrived in front of. He paused, letting the moment build, and then his gaze landed on me again. "And here's my daughter," he said, his voice taking on that familiar teasing tone. "The family failure, still single, still wandering the world." The words hit the room like a physical force. Laughter rippled through the crowd, nervous at first, then building as people assumed this was part of Dad's usual routine. Even my siblings chuckled, thinking this was just Dad being Dad, roasting everyone equally. I sat perfectly still, my champagne glass halfway to my lips, my expression unchanged. Years of military training had taught me how to maintain composure under fire, and this was just another form of combat. I sipped my champagne, kept my back straight, and let my father's words wash over me without flinching. But inside, the sting was sharp and immediate. This wasn't playful teasing anymore. This was public humiliation, delivered with surgical precision in front of everyone who mattered to our family. Dad had found his target and hit it perfectly, getting the laugh he wanted while making his point about what he considered success and failure. The applause that followed felt like nails on a chalkboard. 200 people clapping for a joke that reduced 15 years of military service to a punchline about my inability to find a husband. I smiled along because the alternative was making a scene, but every instinct I developed as a Marine was screaming at me to respond. I thought about standing up, taking the microphone, and setting the record straight. I thought about listing my deployments, my medals, my responsibilities. I thought about explaining to this room full of comfortable civilians what service really meant, what I'd sacrificed to earn the right to wear the uniform they'd never see. Instead, I finished my champagne and signaled the waiter for another glass. My friend from my unit, seated at a nearby table, caught my eye and shook his head slightly. He'd heard enough of my stories to know what Dad didn't. "Guess they don't know," he mouthed, and I nodded once in acknowledgement. The toast continued for another few minutes, Dad wrapping up with heartfelt wishes for the bride and groom. The crowd responded enthusiastically, raising their glasses and applauding his performance. He delivered exactly what they'd expected: humor, warmth, and just enough edge to keep things interesting. As he returned the microphone to the bandleader, Dad caught my eye and winked. He thought he'd been clever, delivering a good-natured roast that would become part of family lore. He had no idea he'd just crossed a line I'd been guarding for years, no idea that his middle daughter was done accepting his version of who she was supposed to be. I stood and walked to the ladies' room, needing a moment to collect myself. In the mirror, I looked exactly like what I was, a woman who'd spent her adult life learning how to handle impossible situations with grace under pressure. My father saw failure where there should have been pride. He saw wandering where there should have been recognition of service. When I returned to my seat, the dancing had begun and Dad was leading my mother around the floor, looking every inch the distinguished patriarch. The other guests had moved on from his toast, but I carried his words with me like shrapnel. That was when I made my decision. Not out of anger or revenge, but out of something simpler and more fundamental. I was tired of being invisible in my own family story. I was tired of pretending my career was just a quirky life choice rather than a calling that had shaped everything I was. My father wanted to define me as the family failure. Tonight, I was going to let him meet the woman his middle daughter had actually become. I sat at my table, letting the noise of the reception blur into background static while my mind went perfectly clear. This was a feeling I recognized from combat zones, the moment when chaos crystallizes into focus, when all the noise falls away and you see exactly what needs to be done. Around me, the party continued as if nothing had changed. Couples swayed on the dance floor, guests clustered around the bar, children darted between tables chasing each other with ribbons from the centerpieces. My father held court near the wedding cake, regaling a group of his insurance buddies with what was probably an expanded version of his toast, milking every laugh. My friend from my unit, Staff Sergeant Rodriguez, appeared at my elbow. "You holding up okay?" "I'm fine." He studied my face with the attention of someone who'd been in firefights with me. That's your someone's about to get their ass kicked expression. Is it obvious? Only to people who've seen you work. He glanced toward my father, then back to me. What are you thinking? I considered the question carefully. What was I thinking? That I'd spent 15 years proving myself to strangers who'd never doubted me, while the man who raised me had written me off as a disappointment. That I'd earned the respect of Marines and generals while my own father introduced me to friends as his wandering daughter who couldn't figure out real life. I'm thinking, I said slowly, that he doesn't know who I am. Rodriguez nodded. Question is, do you plan to educate him? Before I could answer, my nephew appeared at my side, tugging on my dress. Aunt Leslie, Dad says you're like a soldier. Is that true? 8 years old, all curiosity and wide eyes. I knelt down to his level, grateful for the interruption. I'm a Marine, buddy. Different branch. What's the difference? Marines are tougher, I said, ruffling his hair. Don't tell your dad I said that. He giggled and ran off to rejoin the other kids, leaving me with a moment of clarity. This was what mattered, not my father's opinion of my choices, but the example I set for the next generation. My nephew would grow up knowing his aunt was a Marine, regardless of what his grandfather thought about it. I thought about every medal I'd earned, every commendation that had been read aloud to formations of Marines who understood what it meant. The Bronze Star for actions in Iraq. The Meritorious Service Medal for my work training Afghan security forces. The combat action ribbon that marked me as someone who'd been under fire and returned it. None of that existed in my father's world. To him, I was still the quiet middle child who'd never figured out how to be impressive in the ways that counted. He measured success in wedding rings and mortgage payments, in Christmas cards with family photos and grandchildren who called on Sunday nights. I understood his perspective, even disagreed with it respectfully. But I was done letting him define me by his limitations. My mother appeared at my table, looking concerned. You seem quiet, honey. Everything okay? Just thinking. She sat down beside me, smoothing her dress. Your father means well, you know. He just worries about you being so far from home all the time. Is that what he calls it? Worrying. Mom's expression tightened slightly. She'd heard the toast too, seen the laughter that followed. He's proud of you. He just doesn't know how to say it. No, Mom. He's embarrassed by me. There's a difference. She started to protest, but I held up a hand. It's okay. I'm not angry. But I'm not going to pretend anymore that my career is something I should apologize for. My phone buzzed with a text message. I glanced down and smiled for the first time all evening. Perfect timing. What is it? Mom asked. Just confirming some arrangements I made. I stood and straightened my dress, feeling something shift inside me like tumblers falling into place. Excuse me for a minute. I walked to the ladies' room again, not because I needed to, but because I needed to center myself for what came next. In the mirror, I looked at the woman I'd become, 32 years old, confident in ways my teenage self couldn't have imagined, shaped by experiences my father would never understand or appreciate. He'd called me the family failure in front of 200 people. He'd reduced 15 years of service to a punchline about being single and rootless. He'd done it with a smile, thinking he was being clever, never considering that his words might actually hurt. I wasn't going to embarrass him in return. I wasn't going to make a scene or deliver a speech about everything he didn't know about my life. I was simply going to let him see, for just a moment, exactly who his middle daughter had become while he wasn't paying attention. When I returned to the ballroom, I checked my watch. 5 more minutes. Rodriguez caught my eye from across the room and raised an eyebrow. I nodded once, the same signal we'd used in Iraq when an operation was about to commence. He grinned and raised his champagne glass in a silent toast. My father was still near the cake, still surrounded by admirers, still basking in the success of his perfectly orchestrated event. In a few minutes, that was going to change. Not because I wanted to ruin his evening, but because some truths were too important to leave unspoken. The ballroom doors were about to open, and my father was about to meet the daughter he'd never bothered to really see. At exactly 9:30, the ballroom doors opened with military precision. The conversations near the entrance faltered first, Then the silence spread like ripples across water as heads turned toward the sound of synchronized footsteps. The Marine Corps Honor Guard marched into the room in perfect formation, 6 Marines in dress blue uniforms that seemed to absorb and reflect the chandelier light simultaneously. Their white gloves were pristine, their brass polished to mirror brightness, their bearings so flawless they might have been carved from marble. Each step landed with identical precision, the sound echoing off the ballroom walls like a drumbeat. 200 guests turned to stare, champagne glasses frozen halfway to lips, conversations dying mid-sentence. Children stopped running between tables. The band ceased playing. Even the waitstaff paused in their duties, silver trays balanced in their hands as they watched the honor guard approach. I stood as they neared my table, my movements automatic after years of military protocol. The lead Marine, a gunnery sergeant with ribbons that spoke of multiple deployments, halted 3 feet from my chair. His eyes met mine with the recognition of shared service, shared sacrifice, shared understanding of what it meant to wear the uniform with honor. "Good evening, ma'am," he said, his voice carrying clearly through the silent ballroom. "Good evening, gunnery sergeant." In perfect unison, all 6 Marines raised their white-gloved hands in salute. Not the casual wave civilians might expect, but the crisp, respectful salute reserved for those who'd earned it through service and sacrifice. Their heels came together with a single sharp click that seemed to reverberate through the suddenly still air. The silence in the room was absolute. I could hear the sound of my own heartbeat, the whisper of fabric as people shifted in their chairs to get a better view. Somewhere behind me, I heard the distinct sound of glass hitting marble as my father's champagne flute slipped from his hand and shattered on the floor. I returned the salute with the same crisp precision I'd learned at Paris Island 15 years ago, my hand moving to the correct position without conscious thought. For a moment, the ballroom faded away, and there was nothing but the ancient ritual of military respect, the recognition that passes between those who've served and those currently serving. "Thank you for your service, Staff Sergeant," the gunnery sergeant said, using my rank with the same respect he'd show a general. "Thank you for yours, Marines." The honor guard held their salute for exactly 5 seconds, long enough for every person in that room to understand they were witnessing something significant, something that spoke to a world beyond wedding receptions and champagne toasts. Then they dropped their hands in unison and executed a perfect about-face, marching out of the ballroom with the same precision they'd brought to their entrance. The doors closed behind them, and for several heartbeats, the silence stretched. Then conversations resumed in whispers, guests leaning toward each other with questions and speculation. I remained standing until the sound of their footsteps faded completely, then slowly returned to my seat. The effect on the room was immediate and dramatic. Guests who'd barely acknowledged me all evening suddenly approached my table, wanting to know about my service, my deployments, my rank. Relatives I hadn't spoken to in years asked about my medals, my responsibilities, my plans for the future. But I wasn't watching the guests. I was watching my father. He stood frozen near the wedding cake, his face cycling through expressions I'd never seen before. Confusion gave way to recognition to something that might have been understanding. His confident smile had vanished, replaced by the look of a man who'd just realized he'd been operating with incomplete information. My mother appeared at his side, her hand on his arm, whispering something urgent in his ear. He nodded absently but didn't take his eyes off me. For the first time in my adult life, my father was really seeing me, not the quiet middle child who'd never figured out how to be impressive, but the Marine Staff Sergeant who'd earned the respect of the Honor Guard. My brother materialized at my table, his expression a mixture of awe and sheepishness. "Jesus, Ducker. I had no idea they did things like that. Most people don't. Dad's pretty shaken up." I glanced toward our father, who was still standing motionless near the cake, still staring in my direction. "I imagine he is." That was impressive. It wasn't meant to be impressive. It was meant to be accurate. My sister appeared then, still in her wedding dress, her face flushed with excitement and confusion. What just happened? Who were those men? Marine Honor Guard. They were recognizing my service. I didn't know you could arrange things like that. You can't, normally. but I have friends who thought tonight might be an appropriate time for the gesture. She looked toward Dad, then back at me. He feels terrible about his toast. Does he? He says he was just joking around. I know what he was doing. The rest of the evening passed in a blur of conversations with relatives who suddenly wanted to know about my career, my experiences, my future plans. People who'd treated my military service as an interesting hobby now approached it with something resembling respect. But the most significant moment came near the end of the night, when my father finally approached my table. He moved like a man walking through water, each step deliberate and careful. When he reached me, he stood silently for a long moment, his hands clasped behind his back. "I owe you an apology," he said finally. "Do you?" "I said things tonight that were unfair. Unkind." I studied his face, looking for the sincerity behind the words. "You said what you believed to be true." I was wrong. It wasn't enough. Not yet, not after years of dismissal and diminishment. But it was a beginning, the first crack in a wall that had been building between us for longer than either of us wanted to admit. "Yes," I said simply. "You were." 3 weeks later, my father called while I was reviewing training schedules in my office at Camp Pendleton. I almost let it go to voicemail. Our conversation since the wedding had been stilted, both of us navigating unfamiliar territory with the careful politeness of former enemies attempting diplomacy. "Leslie, do you have a minute?" His voice carried none of its usual confidence. Over the years, I'd grown accustomed to Dad's phone calls following a predictable pattern: 5 minutes of small talk, updates about family members I saw once a year, and gentle suggestions that I should consider settling down somewhere closer to home. This call felt different from the first word. "I'm here. I've been thinking about the wedding. About what happened." I waited. Silence was a tool I'd learned to use effectively in both military and family contexts. Let the other person fill the space. Reveal their position before committing to your own. "I called your mother's brother. You remember Uncle Bill, right? He was in the army back in Vietnam. I asked him to explain some things to me." Uncle Bill. I remembered him as a quiet man who drank too much at family gatherings and never talked about his service. He'd nod at me occasionally when I was in uniform, but we'd never discussed our shared experience of military life. "What did he tell you?" "He told me I was an idiot." Dad's laugh was hollow, self-deprecating in a way I'd never heard from him before. He explained what it means when the honor guard shows up somewhere. Said they don't do that for just anyone. "No, they don't." He also told me about some of the things you've probably done, places you've probably been. Said I should have been asking you questions instead of making assumptions. I could picture Uncle Bill having that conversation, probably over beers in Dad's garage, 2 older men discussing something one of them had never bothered to understand. The image made me sad in ways I wasn't ready to examine. "Did he tell you anything else?" "He told me his daughter. You remember your cousin Jennifer? She's been thinking about joining the military after college. He said she looks up to you, has been following your career for years. I didn't even know you two stayed in touch." Jennifer and I exchanged emails occasionally, brief updates about our lives. I'd encouraged her interest in military service, but hadn't realized she'd been serious about it. The idea that I'd influenced her decision without knowing it was both gratifying and sobering. "She never mentioned it to you?" "Kids don't tell their parents everything, I guess." Another pause. "Kind of like how you never told me about the medals." There it was, the heart of his confusion. In Dad's world, achievements were meant to be displayed, celebrated, shared with family and friends. The idea that I'd earned significant recognition without trumpeting it challenged his understanding of how success was supposed to work. "You never asked." "I know. That's on me." The admission surprised me more than it should have. Dad had never been quick to accept responsibility for his mistakes, preferring to reframe problems as misunderstandings or communication failures. Hearing him take direct ownership of his blindness felt like a fundamental shift in our relationship. "I looked up some of those medals online," he continued. "The Bronze Star, that's for heroism in combat, right?" "Among other things, yes." "What did you do to earn it?" For a moment, I considered giving him the sanitized version, the official citation language that reduced life and death decisions to administrative prose. Instead, I found myself telling him the truth. about the convoy ambush outside Fallujah, about the decision to leave cover and retrieve wounded Marines under fire, about the 20 minutes that had earned me recognition I'd never discussed with anyone outside my unit. He listened without interrupting, asking only clarifying questions that demonstrated he was trying to understand rather than simply waiting for his turn to talk. When I finished, the silence stretched longer than usual. "I'm proud of you," he said finally. 3 words I'd been waiting to hear for 15 years, delivered in a voice thick with emotion I'd rarely heard from my father. They should have felt triumphant, vindication for years of seeking his approval while pretending I didn't need it. Instead, they felt bittersweet. Proud of what? The daughter he'd finally bothered to see, or the daughter I'd always been while he wasn't paying attention? Thank you. I know it's probably too little, too late. It's not too late. But it's going to take time. I understand. I just wanted you to know that I see you differently now. Better. More clearly. After we hung up, I sat in my office thinking about the conversation, about the man my father was trying to become and the relationship we might eventually build. He was making an effort, reaching across a gap he'd helped create. That meant something. But forgiveness and trust were different animals entirely. He'd spent years dismissing my choices, my career, my life's work. One phone call, however sincere, couldn't erase the pattern of diminishment that had defined our relationship. I was willing to try, though. Not because he deserved immediate absolution, but because the alternative, permanent estrangement, served no one. My father was learning to see me as I actually was rather than as he'd assumed I should be. That was progress worth acknowledging. The next time he called, maybe we'd talk about my upcoming deployment to Afghanistan. Maybe he'd ask questions about my Marines, my responsibilities, my plans for the future. Maybe he'd start introducing me to people as his daughter, the Marine, rather than his daughter who couldn't settle down. Or maybe it would take more time, more conversations, more moments of honesty before we found our way to something that looked like mutual respect. Either way, I was no longer waiting for his approval to validate my choices. The honor guard had reminded me, and him, that my worth wasn't dependent on his recognition. But if he wanted to learn who I really was, I was finally ready to let him try. 5 years have passed since my sister's wedding, and the story has taken on a life of its own in family lore. Not the story my father intended to tell that night, but the one that actually unfolded when the honor guard walked through those ballroom doors and saluted his middle daughter. People still mention it at family gatherings, the night Dad learned who I really was. The phrase has become shorthand for the moment our family dynamics shifted, when assumptions gave way to understanding, when years of misperception finally met reality. My relationship with Dad evolved slowly, like a bone healing after a clean break. There were awkward phone calls and stilted conversations, moments when we both retreated to familiar patterns of dismissal and defense. But gradually, something new emerged between us. Not the easy affection he shared with my siblings, but something more deliberate and harder one. He started asking different questions. Instead of still enjoying the military, he'd ask about my Marines, my training responsibilities, the challenges of leadership in high-stress environments. Instead of suggestions about settling down, he'd mention articles he'd read about military operations or veteran issues. Small changes, but they accumulated into something that felt like genuine interest. The breakthrough came during my final deployment to Afghanistan, when I was serving as operations officer for a training mission in Helmand province. Dad had started sending care packages, not just to me, but to my entire unit. Homemade cookies from Mom, magazines, playing cards, practical items that showed he'd actually listened when I mentioned what we needed. One package arrived with a letter addressed to Staff Sergeant Dowker and her Marines. Inside, Dad had written about how proud he was of the work we were doing, how much he'd learned about military service from our conversations. He signed it, "From a grateful father and citizen." My Marines were impressed. "Your old man finally figured it out," my platoon sergeant observed, reading over my shoulder. "Took him long enough." "Better late than never, Staff Sergeant." When I returned from that deployment, Dad met me at the airport. Not with flowers or fanfare, but with something more valuable. Questions that showed he'd been following the news from Afghanistan, paying attention to the regions where I'd been stationed. For the first time, he understood enough about my work to worry intelligently about my safety. "How are your Marines handling the transition back?" he asked as we drove home. "Some better than others. It's always an adjustment. If any of them need anything, jobs, references, someone to talk to, let me know." The offer surprised me. Dad was a small-town insurance agent with no military background, but he was volunteering to help young Marines find their footing in civilian life. It was his way of acknowledging that my professional family deserved the same consideration as our biological one. My career progressed in ways that satisfied me professionally without requiring his validation. I made gunnery sergeant, then first sergeant, eventually becoming the senior enlisted advisor for a training battalion. Each promotion brought increased responsibility, respect from peers and subordinates, and the deep satisfaction that comes from doing work that matters. Dad learned to take pride in my achievements without needing to fully understand them. When I received the Navy Commendation Medal for my work developing training protocols, he called to congratulate me. When I was selected for the Sergeant's Major Academy, he asked intelligent questions about what the program would involve. Most importantly, he stopped trying to fix what he perceived as the missing pieces in my life. No more comments about marriage or settling down. No more introductions that emphasized what I lacked rather than what I'd accomplished. When he talked about me to friends and neighbors now, it was as his daughter, the first sergeant, with genuine pride in his voice. The wedding toast became a cautionary tale he told other parents, usually over beers at backyard barbecues. "You think you know your kids," he'd say, "but sometimes you're not paying attention to who they really are." It was his way of processing his own blindness, turning his mistake into wisdom he could share with others. My nephew, now 13, wants to join the Marines when he graduates high school. My brother has mixed feelings about it, but Dad has been surprisingly supportive, asking me to talk to the boy about what military service really involves. It's a responsibility I take seriously, not to recruit him, but to ensure his decision is based on accurate information rather than romanticized notions of military life. "Is it hard?" my nephew asked during our last conversation. "Yes. It's the hardest thing you'll ever do and the thing you'll be most proud of." "Were you scared when you deployed?" "Every time. Anyone who says they weren't is lying. Grandpa says you saved people's lives." "I did my job. Same as everyone else in my unit." These conversations with my nephew have become some of my most important family interactions. Not because I'm trying to influence his future, but because I'm finally able to talk openly about my experiences with someone who sees military service as something admirable rather than something to be explained or excused. Dad sits in on these conversations sometimes, asking his own questions, learning alongside his grandson. It's a second chance for both of us, his opportunity to understand what he missed the first time, my opportunity to share my experiences with family members who are genuinely interested in hearing them. I've been promoted to Sergeant Major now, responsible for the professional development of hundreds of Marines across multiple units. It's work that requires everything I've learned over 20 years of service: leadership, judgment, the ability to see potential in young people and help them realize it. When I call home with news about my career, Dad listens with the attention of someone who's finally learned to value what he's hearing. He asks follow-up questions, remembers details from previous conversations, and demonstrates the kind of engaged interest I'd given up hope of receiving from him. The relationship we have now isn't the one I wanted as a young Marine seeking her father's approval. It's better, built on mutual respect rather than need, on understanding rather than assumption. He sees me clearly now, and I've learned to appreciate the effort it took for him to get there. My mother tells me he brags about me to anyone who'll listen, describing my responsibilities and achievements with the same enthusiasm he once reserved for my siblings' conventional milestones. She says he keeps newspaper clippings about military events, trying to understand the larger context of my career. "He's proud of you," she said during our last conversation. He always was, but he didn't know how to show it. I believe her mostly. But pride without understanding isn't particularly meaningful. What matters is that he made the effort to learn, to see beyond his own preconceptions, and recognize the value in a life path he'd never considered valid. The wedding toast still stings sometimes when I remember the laughter that followed his words, the casual cruelty of dismissing 15 years of service as failure. But it also marked the beginning of something better between us, the moment when his assumptions collided with reality and reality won. I don't need his approval anymore, which makes his respect more meaningful when it comes. I've built a life and career based on my own values, serving alongside people who understand what dedication and sacrifice really mean. His recognition is a gift, not a necessity. Sometimes justice is just standing tall while others finally see who you've been all along. Sometimes it's watching a relationship rebuilt on better foundation, stronger for having weathered the storm of honest confrontation. Sometimes it's knowing that your example might inspire the next generation to choose service over comfort, purpose over convention. The honor guard salute at my sister's wedding lasted exactly 5 seconds, but its impact continues to ripple through our family years later. My father learned that his middle daughter wasn't the family failure, she was the family Marine. And that made all the difference. That's how I learned that sometimes the people closest to you need to see your worth reflected in other people's eyes before they can recognize it themselves. The relationship my father and I have now isn't perfect, but it's built on truth instead of his assumptions about who I should be. So here's my question for you. Have you ever had to prove your worth to family members who should have seen it all along? How did you handle being underestimated by the people whose opinion mattered most to you? Drop your experiences in the comments below. I read every single one, and your story might help someone else going through the same thing. If this resonated with you, hit that like button and subscribe for more real stories about setting boundaries, demanding respect, and sometimes having to show people exactly who you are when they refuse to see it. And remember, your worth isn't determined by whether others recognize it. But when they finally do, that's a moment worth savoring.